I think sustainable development is really hard to pin down. We would like to imagine that it's all good things. It's about not just the welfare and well-being of all humans, but that it's also a way of being respectful of our planetary limits, of the ways in which natural resources are finite, and a way of also then thinking about not just humans in the present, but also future generations. And yet when we try to operationalize the concept and think about exactly how sustainable development should be brought about, we run into a whole series of issues which are to do with power inequalities, with often not knowing what the trade-offs are. Urgent needs today might require urgent solutions, but with disastrous effects down the line and so on. So there's a whole host of political, cultural, technical and other questions that make sustainable development a really hard concept to imagine as well as to operationalize. When I think of the kinds of social movements that I've studied, I think that all of them are in their own way trying to bring about a fairer world for themselves. And these are movements of people who have been threatened by displacement by large dams, people who are fighting to save forests because they depend on forests for their everyday life, for their very survival. I think of poor people in cities who migrate there in search of work and want secure shelter and a better life for their children. And all of these people are striving for social justice. And that involves trying to also lay claim to the environment, which has either been to resources that have been taken away from them or resources that they have always been deprived of. Whether that fight for social justice is also one for greater ecological sustainability is an open question. But when I think of all the struggles that go on in order to make the world fairer, fighting against large corporations that are going to mine land or drown it, or in other ways create ecological havoc on a scale that we haven't seen before, then certainly I see these movements for social justice as also striving for some kind of ecological welfare as well. But I think what we really need in order to make these movements even more ecologically benign is not simply to claim greater equality in terms of how resources are distributed, but I think they are best able to defend an ecological principle when they come together with environmentalists, when they come together with other kinds of groups who are also interested in trying to bring about not just greater equity, but greater sustainability. And what I mean here are, say, movements by tribal people, by Adivasis, who want to defend lands and forests and rivers, but at the same time also want to improve their lives. And unless they are supported by environmentalists and by a government that recognizes that they're entitled to basic welfare and delivers that, they're actually likely to go on using resources in unsustainable ways. I think it's very important to recognize that poor people have been so deprived and so discriminated against that they're no longer in a position to themselves serve as an alternative to a very destructive mode of development that has been practiced not just in India but around the world. I think they need support to make their lives better, and that then puts them in a stronger position to defend the resources that are so critical to their survival. I think the first step that any government must take in order to help people make their lives better is to focus attention on the very poorest of the poor. That's what Gandhi said, right? I mean, he said, when I think of any decision that needs to be taken and I don't know what is right and what is wrong, I think of the poorest person and I think of his or her welfare and how my decision will help them or hurt them. So I think that if one can strive for basic welfare and a life of dignity for poor people. That would be the first step towards undoing a lot of the great harm that has been done by the government in the name of development, be it taking resources away from the poor, a direction of urban development where well-to-do people's concerns and needs have been prioritized over that of poor people, and so on. Just a sheer neglect of what the welfare of the large majority might do. Not just a neglect, but sometimes an active injury to their interests. So I think beginning from that, but also noting that welfare for all needn't be that mindful of the future, needn't be that mindful of ecological integrity, is an important element to add to the picture, which is where I think environmentalists come in. That's where I think people who are able to work with communities, be it on the issue of sustainable agriculture, be it around water management, we need all of these kinds of inputs, which have to come from engineers, they have to come from social scientists, they have to come from people in the biological sciences, but it means that they have to make sure that their expertise works in making poor people's lives better for themselves, rather than imposing solutions that they think are in their interest, but actually might not be. I've been very struck by the way in which the debate on climate change has focused on a kind of universal problem. We're all affected by climate change. We all need to mobilize and do something about it. But I think it's important to remember that climate change is just one more uncertainty in the lives of people who already lead hugely uncertain lives. When you're at the mercy of pests and prices and all kinds of uncertain variables in your environment, climate change isn't something that comes and transforms everything. It's just one more element of changing patterns of rainfall or greater aridity, or different patterns of say rising coastlines and so on. So I don't want to underplay the importance of climate change, but I do think that if you want to understand people's adaptation to and resilience towards climate change, we have to look at what they already do. How do they already cope with the huge uncertainties that mark their lives? How do they strive to take control and do the best they can under conditions which are already quite adverse? So I think it's in that light that I would regard climate change, not as something that changes the environment as we know it in some unprecedented way, but as something which is part of a cumulative burden that poor people deal with. I think all of the steps that try to institutionalize accountability, be they environmental impact assessments, which include public hearings, be they other modes of bringing in public participation, have happened at the end of a long struggle. And governments have been reluctant to open themselves up to any kind of public scrutiny. Partly it's because it's such a cozy relationship for the government, for politicians, and for large corporate firms and other interested parties, because that's the political economy of development in India. There is a very, very unequal power structure in which it's convenient for some people to carry out certain kinds of projects which bring large profits, which have large percentages that you can use as commissions, which result in elections being funded and so on. So it's within that hugely unequal power structure that we have poor communities trying to get their voice heard and their decisions and decisions made which suits their interests. I think that institutionalization is still very poor, and that's why we have social movements. Why would people take to the streets to protest if they had institutional mechanisms to make their voice heard, to have their concerns taken into account? I think a lot of people look at social movements in India and say, hey, that's wonderful, that's democracy. But it's actually at one level a sign of a pathology that our institutions have failed us. So I think the fight for greater institutionalization of genuine public participation has still a very long way to go. And it's something that I see people striving for, using the few legal weapons that we have, using the few procedural ways that are open to us. But there is a lot more to be done. And I think the social movements, for all their heroism in the face of the overwhelming odds that they're fighting against, can only sort of concretize and consolidate what they have gained by then working with legal advocacy groups, by working with parliamentary groups, by working with people within the formal institutional structure of government, as much as working outside it to mobilize people. Disciplines are, as the name suggests, they do discipline people. They discipline people to think in a particular way, to act in a particular way. And while we all derive strength from having a particular orientation, at times it can be a limitation as well. And in India, we're not very good at doing interdisciplinary work, partly because of our educational system, and then later, because of the way in which our governments are structured. People have a lot of interest in defending their turf and not letting other people participate. So I think an institution like this, which actually encourages and fosters people across disciplines to come together, is an important first step. But that second step must be that the disciplines and people who are talking to each other across them actually then work and engage very directly with people on the ground, and let the direction of research be shaped by what they tell them. And what this then requires is very long and sustained engagement. It's not something that can come out of a short duration research project. It's something that has to happen over a lifetime. It's something that requires a degree of humility to realize that one must unlearn the notion of expertise that one's disciplines have instilled in one, and be willing to just go out and say, well, I do have these skills, but how can my skills be put at the service of other people? So rather than knowing that we have the answers, which all of us tend to do because we've read so much or we've done so much research, I think what we need to do really is put that down for a moment and be open-minded about the complexity of the world and our own very small place in trying to shape the solution. Because at the end of the day, we are also a part of a power structure in which, because of our expertise, because of our resources, we are able to go in and out of situations with very little accountability. And I think remembering that we have to be responsible to the people that we are meant to be serving is a very important element to keep in mind in whatever one does. My interest in urban environmental politics started when I found that most environmental studies in India were preoccupied, as was I, with questions around rural resource conflicts, be they forests, water, land. And even though we were experiencing an explosion in terms of people moving to cities, we still didn't have a good way of understanding these issues in an urban context. My first concern was to actually try and pin down what the environment means for different people in the urban context. And I found that my initial assumption that this was about resources like water or land, etc., actually didn't help very much, because what poor people wanted in the urban context was something as basic as a place to live. Their concerns were more to do with access to sanitation, much more to do with jobs. And I found that it was only middle-class environmentalists who were concerned much more with what might be called public environmental concerns, like air pollution, water pollution, congestion in the city, and so on. And I found that unlike the countryside, where there seemed to be a clear coalition between poor people and trying to protect the environment, what's been called an environmentalism of the poor, in the urban context, I found there were upper middle class people, what I call bourgeois environmentalists, who were trying to protect the environment as they saw it. But their attempts brought them up sharply against poor people who were seen as people destroying the environment, dirtying the city, squatting on public grounds, polluting, and so on. So I had to reconfigure what the environment means for different people and the ways in which the discourse of environmentalism could actually be co-opted by an already privileged social group to try and exclude poor people from access to the city. One of the most common things that I would hear upper class people say is, oh, they should go back to where they belong. So this idea that poor people should stay in the countryside, never mind that they're dealing with horrible conditions there, and they come to the city only because they're compelled to do so, because this is where the jobs are, this is where they can actually make a better living, was something that they just didn't want to confront. So I became equally interested in how the discourse of environmentalism gets used to make certain kinds of claims in the city. That is not just about environment conflicts in the sense of natural resources, but that it can become something which can speak at different levels to people's imagination of what the city is. And since the vision of a world-class city has been pursued in India, I find that, in fact, conditions for poor people have become much harsher. So there is an attempt to try and be like Shanghai or Singapore, tall skyscrapers and the sort of smooth, sanitized environment. But there's very little attempt to recognize that you can only have that kind of development in India as long as there are poor people to make the city work. And a city must create space for all of these people because they are the lifeblood of the city. So I think trying to bring in the concerns of poor people, their perceptions of what they expect of the urban environment, is a very important element to keep in mind when dealing with urbanization. Because often urbanization is seen as a set of techno-managerial initiatives. Now we hear talk about smart cities, and it's really a puzzle to me how one can have a vision of a smart city which is all to do with technologies of e-governance and surveillance and so on, without looking at the fact that real smartness lies in getting poor people access to certain basic things like shelter, like health and education. Unless your citizens are smart, you can't have smart cities. So I think that there is a real need to question the ways in which urbanization and policies about urbanization are being rolled out in ways which are so completely at odds with what the majority of our citizens actually need and find important. I think in cities it's been harder for people to put together coalitions of interests that unite the concerns of poor migrants and poor workers in the city with those of environmental protection and so on. I look, for instance, at water bodies like, say, lakes in Bangalore, the river Yamuna in Delhi, and I find that these are sites where you need to have better understanding of the dependence of poor people on those environments, and then an appreciation of how these areas work as wetlands, as major sources of biodiversity in the city. So in the case of Delhi, I know that there have been attempts by a group called the Yamuna GA Abhiyan to try and bring together small farmers and groups of poor slum dwellers, as well as environmentalists, to think about how the Yamuna floodplain can be a place where there is groundwater recharge, which is a genuine floodplain in the sense of protecting the city from floods, but which is also able to accommodate the livelihoods of poor people. These are very small efforts, but I think they're important ones because they are what we need in order to progress towards a vision of cities which are ecologically more sustainable, but that are also socially just. And I think to have one without the other, it would be a real tragedy. And that's what we're heading towards. I'd say the first and the biggest challenge is housing and sanitation. And that's where we find the biggest, I think, possibility for doing things very differently. There are extremely interesting models in terms of having both ways of developing urban land and housing, as well as dealing with new sanitation systems which are not so water intensive and so on, which actually need to be tried out in cities. And that would also be a way of dealing with our extremely polluted water bodies in all cities. That would also be a way of equalizing the enormous injustice that exists in cities around the question of basic rights to life, because where you live and where you work are the most important questions that govern whether people are able to make a go of it in the city or not, whether they can get a better life or not. I think food is such an important element of everybody's life that it was impossible as an anthropologist and as a sociologist to ignore it. And yet I was struck by the way in which academic writing about food as well as popular writing about food tended to focus only on well-to-do people in big cities. As in, look, they're eating out more, or look, they can now eat Thai food, and now we can get avocados in our stores. And this was part of the greater celebration of globalization, the emergence of a consuming elite within Indian society following economic liberalization and so on. But there was very little attention to the fact that poor people were eating very, very differently from what they did a generation ago. And even though India has had a large and very powerful right to food movement that has been doing its best to make sure that people had access to basic food, even this movement was not really grappling with the fact that people were thinking about food in ways which were about more than just securing the basics. They were engaging much more with a market economy in which they wanted to eat not only what their parents had eaten, but they wanted to eat more processed foods. They wanted to try out new kinds of cuisine, and increasingly food has also been a way of asserting one's cultural identity in I think unprecedented ways. So for instance, the assertion by Dalits, by the scheduled castes, about their own culture has meant that they have in colleges and universities where they have an organized presence, they have organized beef festivals to make a point about their cultural difference and their strength when upper class Hindu culture has tended to look down on beef as a highly stigmatized food. So I think food has become a site for great transformation, as well as for new kinds of political claims, which it wasn't in quite such a way earlier. So that's what's driven my attention towards food. But the additional interest that I have in food is in terms of how the growing of food, the manufacture of food has affected agrarian environments. I think this change in diets that's happened across the country, across regions, classes, the rural-urban divide, has seriously transformed how agriculture happens in the country. To some extent, we are still dependent heavily on a model of intensive agriculture that came up with the Green Revolution, and that is still the anchor of our public distribution system. But we find now that farmers are growing a lot of exotic crops for, in some cases, for export in areas where there's water. We find that a lot of farmers have taken to new agricultural technologies that were not available, say, 20 years ago. So the increase in, say, milk production, the increase in poultry farming, etc., is something which has quite transformed what dairying used to be, or what keeping chickens in your backyard used to be. And these changes are important not only because they then change diets, that now chicken is a number one form of meat eaten in India, far outpacing goat meat or pork or mutton, etc. But that they also transform agrarian technologies. So take the example of milk production in the country. It started off with having with breeds of cows and with special diets that resulted in greater milk production. But we find that farmers are using drugs like oxytocin, which induce uterine contractions, to get cows to give more milk. And because they use oxytocin, which then causes pain to the animal, they then inject them with a drug, a painkiller called diclofenac. And diclofenac accumulates in cows in such a way that when they die and their carcasses are left out for vultures to eat, the vultures who are very sensitive to diclofenac, their kidneys fail, and we've had a mass extinction of vultures across the country. So just as agricultural technologies change, they also place a huge burden on the environment. I mean, the extinction of vultures in India is just one part of the ways in which antibiotics and other drugs are now in water, the ways in which synthetic pesticides as well as fertilizers have transformed soils and water and so on. So there is an environmental burden of agricultural technologies. There is also a social burden of these technologies that hasn't been looked at very much, except in the extreme case of poor farmers falling into debt and then committing suicide. But the fact that farmer suicides have happened in areas as diverse as Kerala and Punjab, completely different agroecological zones, tells us that there's something seriously wrong with Indian agriculture. And my attempt is to try and link both consumption as well as production, to look at food and to look at the way in which that food has roots into the countryside and what's happening there in terms of how it's produced, in terms of how it's marketed and distributed, and the lives of people at both ends, the producers and the consumers. There's a lot of evidence that shows that the decision to focus on wheat and rice, although it did make India self-sufficient in those cereals in the 1960s and was therefore a very important part of India being independent of the Cold War, did lead to a great change in terms of certainly the environmental impact. These are extremely water-intensive crops, and then the decision to provide irrigation to areas which were actually unsuited for irrigation has had huge costs, not only in terms of the displacement and destruction of water catchments, but also in the fact that a lot of the irrigated areas have seen such poor water management that soils have become waterlogged. Areas have become unfit for agriculture in large parts of Punjab and Haryana and so on. That's the case. But what's also happened is that more nutritious cereals like millets have actually been sidelined because of the way in which the government has supported one set of crops versus another. Something else that I think is a major problem with the extensive spread of rice especially in a subsidized form to poor households across the country through the public distribution system is that it's polished rice. So one finds that there's a very high incidence of type 2 diabetes in rural populations who otherwise don't suffer from the issues of obesity, etc., that often go along with type 2 diabetes in, say, urban areas. So the only way one can understand that puzzle is to look at the way in which rural diets changed because of the public distribution system, a system that gave subsidized rice and wheat to people when it could have perhaps sourced cereals from very many different sources, including millets. And that would not only have promoted dryland agriculture and prevented an over-reliance on irrigated crops, but that would also have kept diets more diverse as well as healthy. Actually, the urban work for me is now coming to a close. I think the kinds of issues that puzzled me in the beginning and that were to do with trying to define what an environmental problem is, that were also to do with trying to understand the circumstances under which poor people are able to come together collectively and fight for their rights. Because in the rural scenario, I could see social movements. In the urban case, I couldn't. And that, to me, has always been a puzzle. Why is it that despite such, huge injustice, why is it that people, aren't able to fight for their rights? So those kinds of questions I have, at least to my satisfaction, answered. But the concern with trying to understand how people understand a certain situation and how they act within it, the cultural practices that come from people's own understanding of the situation in which they find themselves, is very much at the center of this work on food. And for me, the puzzle really is that although there's a very clear understanding, it seems, among people working on nutrition, among food rights activists about what good food is and how it should be made available to people, I find that popular understandings of food, especially among younger people, are quite different. And so for me, that's the challenge, that as we face greater malnutrition, as we face, just aspirations for a better life, how do we make these different conversations come together? How do we move towards a situation where food production is environmentally sustainable, but at the same time culturally satisfying? Because unless people, eat what they want to eat, and unless that comes together with what's good for the environment, and that's, what can be produced in a sustainable way, I think we'll continue to see a lot of just a lot of dissonance between the campaigns and between people's cultural practices. I think that agriculture right now is hugely neglected in both Indian research, academic research, as well as in policy. When I think of, say, the social sciences, there's just a handful of scholars who are working on the nitty-gritty of what farmers do, how they relate to their environment, how they relate to the larger world, and so on. And we have really become obsessed, even, I'd say, with cities. There's an upsurge of research around urban issues. And I think this urban bias is something that really needs to be corrected, because we still have about 60% of our population engaged in some way or the other with agriculture. So I think the Oxford India Centre's focus on agriculture is a really important one, because one needs to keep engaging with issues of rural livelihoods, with issues of the rural environment, in order to be able to correct this urban bias. And there is just so many problems that are neglected and that are critical from the point of view of both ecological as well as social well-being that need attention. I've grown up and mainly lived and worked in India. So Oxford is something which has always carried a great aura of high scholarship, of ancient tradition, etc. With it. So it's been quite a treat to come to Oxford and experience that for myself, to discover the high level of scholarship from the conversations that I've had with people here, the very sharp and provocative questions that I was asked at my talk, which have left me a lot to think about and which have been really tremendously helpful. But also just getting a feel of the life in a college, the collegiality, the meals together, being in these beautiful old buildings and with the gardens and so on. So it's a place where one can get a lot of work done in a concentrated way without having to worry about the everyday things that seem to be such a part of life in India, from the the power cuts to the plumbing. And it's in that sense an ivory tower with all the advantages as well as the I would suppose limitations as well. But I've had a wonderful time and I've really gained from being here. And I think at this stage I just needed that short respite from day-to-day work in order to put my thoughts together. And the conversations at Oxford have really helped me do that. And the very warm hospitality that I have experienced has made it that much more of a pleasure being here.